So, today I want to talk about child labor at an industrial cleaning company. I do not believe that it is a coincidence that this is now the second major case of child labor in US factories that I'm covering this year on this channel. With union activity and labor on the rise, we've seen numerous restaurants attempt to get away with hiring people as young as 14 years of age to avoid paying higher wages. And in several of those cases, we've seen strict child labor law violations. We've also seen politicians and business interests work together to attempt to weaken child labor laws. And while unions are one of the greatest defenses against child labor, we have seen attacks on those very same unions trying to form in plants just like the ones we're about to talk about today. None of that even begins to count the children working in the agricultural sector, a problem that has never been addressed in the United States' history, even when the modern child labor laws were passed in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that said, our current situation features a company, Packers Sanitation Services Incorporated, or PSSI, an industrial cleaning company that is alleged to have employed at least 31 children who were working in hazardous conditions and at nighttime. I say at least because while 31 are confirmed, there is more evidence mounting that seems to indicate that the company may also employ more kids under similar conditions at 400 other sites across the country. Further, there are photographs of clock-in records at 8 other plants that appear to show children present. Meanwhile, the breakdown of the ages of the 31 children that are confirmed thus far is at least a dozen 17-year-olds, 14 16-year-olds, 3 15-year-olds, 1 14-year-old, and 1 13-year-old. Moreover, the children are confirmed to work at 3 different meatpacking plants, one in Grand Island, Nebraska, one in Worthington, Minnesota, and one in Marshall, Minnesota, meaning that this is happening in several different plants in at least 2 states and likely happening in more locations across the United States as a whole. All 3 plants that we currently have confirmed are owned by a company called JBS USA, which is a subsidiary of Turkey Valley Farms, the largest meat processor in the world. And it's also worth mentioning that all of the children that were interviewed and whom were spoken with also speak Spanish. Now, while I do not have any concrete information to confirm this one way or the other, I have to wonder if these are migrant children, especially as the scenario seems remarkably similar to the situation that happened earlier this year in Alabama involving the company Smart Alabama LLC, a subsidiary of Hyundai, who was fined for employing children. In quite a similar scenario, Smart Alabama LLC had used an outside company in order to hire their labor, and that created a plausible deniability about the very clearly young children who were working in their factory on dangerous car equipment. Now, if you want to know more about all of that, check the description down below. I will link it there. That said, child labor is most common amongst migrant workers, especially because speaking up, let alone trying to form a union, and again, a union is one of the best ways to prevent child labor, doing those things can come with a slew of retaliation tactics, including the implementation of ICE and deportation as a weapon against workers. Now, coming back to the current situation, it was discovered that the children were working at the 3 facilities on the night shift, coming in and cleaning the, killing floors and various machines, including meat and bone cutting saws and a grinding machine. Further, one child interviewed by the Department of Labor investigators reported that they worked for PSSI starting when they were 13 years old, cleaning machinery on the kill floor at one of the plants. The 14-year-old worked more than 18 hours per week during overnight shifts and suffered a burn injury from the cleaning chemicals that they used. Meanwhile, another child reported working from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., 5 to 6 days per week, for 4 months when they were 14. They also reported suffering chemical burns and said they fell asleep in their middle school classes and missed school due to their grueling work schedule, given that they were getting off work at 5 in the morning and then probably had to get to school by like 7 at 8 at the latest. There is no way that that's feasible, especially for a young child, someone who's 13 and 14 years of age. Now, these are numerous and severe violations of child labor laws. First and foremost, children are not supposed to be working near, around, or on these types of heavy machines. They are dangerous to operate by adults, let alone by children, and accidents can and will happen. Next, while I cannot speak to the severity of the caustic burns that they experienced, as I don't know what chemical burned them, it should be evident that it is hazardous for young children to be using cleaning chemicals that are strong enough to cause that type of burn and injury in the first place. Chemical burns are no joke, and they can cause serious infection and long term scarring, and it's something that should be taken extremely seriously. Further, you had one child who was 13 years old and clearly should not have been working at all under these current labor laws. And the remaining children who theoretically could work if it was not in a place that had hazardous conditions. However, of course, all of these sites did in fact have hazardous conditions, but they're not allowed to work outside of prescribed times, even in a safer facility, especially on school nights. The graveyard shift is certainly outside of those prescribed times, and a clear violation of labor law. The fact is that teenagers are still growing up. They need their sleep, they need to care for themselves, and additionally, these children are being denied the ability to stay awake in class and get an education, something that is really important and could have long term impacts both economically and socially, especially in terms of the creation of cycles of poverty. Perhaps most important, though, is that they're being denied their childhood, something that I still believe should be considered sacred and important for any child to have. It also needs to be said that there is no way in my mind that these facilities did not know that they were hiring children. It's not difficult to tell when someone working for you is 13 years of age. Companies like these prefer to hire children instead of adults for certain jobs because they're much less equipped to fight back against abuses and have a much greater chance to not be knowledgeable on labor laws and protections. In short, these businesses, like capitalism as a whole, prey on the vulnerable. Additionally, if migrant labor is involved, as I suspect it is, fear of retaliation may have made it so that many adult employees didn't report the problem. And if it wasn't migrant workers or maybe a combination thereof, we do have confirmed that many of the people who work at PSSI have felony records. And that can make finding alternative work more difficult if retaliation does happen and they lose their jobs. In either case, we have a situation where adult workers who are forced to stay, or they're forced to stay silent on such issues because they could lose their only means of survival and their paycheck if they speak up against this injustice. As an example, we have to look no further than the situation in Alabama, where Hyundai actually removed their affiliation with the companies involved instead of trying to make sure that children were not being employed, and effectively shut down the plants, causing all the adults who actually stood up for what's right and protected children to lose their job and source of income. This is the type of coercion that we see under capitalism that forces people into being complicit in the brutality of this economic system, just in order to survive. Now, of course, the companies involved have they've given their usual denials that they did not know. However, Packers Sanitation Services Incorporated took it a step further and seemed to imply they were blaming the children in all of this. In fact, what they have here is that the spokesperson added that the company mandates the use of federal e-verify systems for new hires, as well as extensive training, document verification, biometrics, and multiple layers of audits. While rogue individuals could of course seek to engage in fraud or identity theft, we are confident in our company's strict compliance policies and will defend ourselves vigorously against these claims. Yes, these children who are rogue individuals are clearly at fault here, and clearly they are responsible for the case of fraud that made it so a company could not identify that a 13-year-old was amongst their employees. That's ridiculous. And to make matters worse, the company is also said to have attempted to thwart and or tamper with the collection of evidence that included by attempting to obstruct investigators' employees' interview by surrounding the rooms where they were being conducted and holding eye contact with the minors. And of course, they apparently didn't know these were minors, and yet they were trying to intimidate them via eye contact like that. And while that does work on some adults, especially if you're from a vulnerable population, that works even stronger on minors, and they know that. Managers also attempted to hide or delete documents, including work related text messages and incident accident reports, the complaint states. And as is par for the course with such companies, in addition to hiring children, they also have a terrible record with their adult employees as well. And that's worth noting because, again, they hire vulnerable populations. And whenever you're hiring vulnerable populations, this is the type of records that we see in these companies. Whether it's children or people with felony records, this is the type of thing that we see. The company has had a troubled worker safety record in recent years. 3 PSSI workers have died on the job since 2018, including one who was decapitated cleaning a chicken chiller. According to Occupational Health and Safety Administration records, a private equity stakeholder project. Meanwhile, it was determined that last year, OSHA cited PSSI for 17 violations for failing to train workers about the dangers of liquid nitrogen after a nitrogen leak killed 6 people who worked for the Foundation Food Group at a poultry plant in Gainesville, Georgia. Those killed were not actually employed by PSSI, but PSSI was responsible for cleaning the plant and thus for making sure its workers were safe there, OSHA had said. And in addition to this, a 2017 analysis by the National Employment Law Project, an advocacy group, found that PSSI had some of the worst rates of workplace injuries in the country. The denial of these claims by the private equity fund that owns PSSI, called Blackstone, comes across as kind of pitiful and lacking, no matter how vehemently they may deny them. These 31 children, and likely a lot more children, deserve a lot better than what they have experienced thus far by being employed by a company like this. The trouble is that in our global system of capitalism, where profit motivation is the primary goal of a company, they will seek these horrific solutions like hiring children rather than paying their adult employees a proper wage. Capitalism continues worldwide to exploit children and other vulnerable populations, and it needs to be understood that this is built in and part of the system. What I'm surprised about, actually, more than anything else at this point, is not that these events are happening, but that some of these companies are actually being caught and kind of being held somewhat responsible, though mostly what they'll end up with is a fine and a slap on the wrist. It's not that these things are happening that's surprising, but the fact that we're even able to report on it and talk about it because it's actually in the media and in the news. Usually, these kind of things are just pushed aside. And this particular article didn't even pop up in my newsfeed, and I'm not entirely sure why, because this is the type of media I want to be talking about on this channel, and it needs to be emphasized and put forward. And not a lot of sources have really covered this. And if we're being realistic here, this type of thing is happening in a bunch of other facilities, and we just don't know it yet. And we can't cover what we don't know. So with that said, if you've learned something here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as consider joining my Discord where we do talk about topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as doing so helps me continue to produce content like this, including the Sunday streams that I do and the 3 videos a week. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. So with that said, my name is Anarchist Terra. Thank you so much for watching.